Well, hello and welcome back to the Pastor's Q&A. I am Pastor Ryan, and I'm here to give you biblical answers to your questions. And so this question comes to us today from one of our listeners. It says this. It says, is love in the Bible an action or a feeling? And if love is an action, then is hate an action or an emotion? So let's dive in. The Bible's concept of love is far more complex than what our culture understands of love today. Our culture has typically reduced love down to simply a set of feelings or nothing more than an emotion because we regard feelings as the final authority for our truth. And so because of that, we have to keep love at this very shallow emotional level. But in the words of the prophets DC Talk, love is a verb. And what this means is that the Bible's concept of love is far more deep and far more nuanced than our current cultural understanding of what love is. And we know from the pages of the Bible that love is more than a feeling because of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells us to love our enemies. And so our enemies are not typically people that we're going to have fond feelings of. Our action of love for our enemies does not flow out of us going, man, I love those enemies. There's just some really good guys. And so it's not always an action that flows from an emotion. Instead, I would say it this way to be a little more nuanced. If love is an emotion, then it will always flow into action. If we feel emotional love, that will flow into action. And if our love starts as an action, like for our enemies, then it will eventually develop into emotion, the emotion of compassion specifically. In other words, our duty will often lead to our desire. So on the first part of that, it doesn't matter how many times I say that I love my wife. If it never manifests into anything else, if all it ever is lip service, if we never go on a date, if I never give her a hug, if I never bring her flowers, if I don't do any of that stuff, it doesn't matter how many times I say it, it's worthless. And this is sort of what John gets into in his epistle, the book of 1 John. He says this in 1 John 3. He says, "By this we know love, that Jesus laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." And so that is the Bible's version of love. How do we love others? It's more than just word and talk. It's in deed and it's in truth. So that's love. Now, what about hate? Does that mean that hate is simply an emotion, or is that hate only reduced to an action? In the same way that you don't reduce love just to an emotion or just to an action, hate can't be reduced to those things either. Now, the most significant passage on this is in the book of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5. Jesus is talking about anger, and this is what he says. He says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the fire of hell." And he goes on to say, if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. And so what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is he's taking some of the 10 Commandments and he's drilling down even deeper. He says, everybody says, well, at least I haven't murdered anybody. And he goes one level deeper. He says, no, it's not just about the physical act of hatred, in this case, murder. It's about what's going on in your heart. Is your heart set on sort of killing them in your mind? Is your heart set on hatred? Do you want the worst for them instead of the best for them? Do you want yourself to get better things than what they're receiving? He says that is hatred, and that is just as sinful as the actual act of murder itself. And so hatred is not just an action. Hatred is that feeling of anger towards somebody that you despise. And so what do we do about this? What do we do about this? Well, Jesus, he again tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. And what we find is that oftentimes when we are loving our enemies, when we're loving them in word and in truth, in word and deed, it starts out as something that really would feel kind of forced. It starts out as something that our heart is not engaged in any way. But as we do that, as we take those action steps to show love to them in very physical, tangible ways, praying for them, loving them, caring for them, often that is followed by a feeling of compassion that wells up inside of us. And you see this in the person of Jesus. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and what does he say about those who are crucifying him? He says, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." And so in the same way, we want to get to that place, not just doing good things for those that inwardly we actually despise, but doing good things towards even our enemies so that we can say, "Father, forgive them." We can have this heart of compassion. And we can only do this because God first loved us. The Bible says that we love because he first loved us. That's what John says in his epistle of 1 John. And so as we receive the love of God, as we embrace God's love, then that love flows out into words, actions, and compassion for others, even our enemies. Well, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. You can follow our podcast. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. And please leave us a review as well. If you want to submit a question, you can go to radiantofcamas.org, and you'll find a number there that you can text or you can send us an email. Find us on Instagram or Facebook, and we will see you next time.